So I'm going to make some brief comments on what has just been read in this part of other people's money. There's three major parts that should be commented on. And thus far, I have attempted to keep it in the general sense without applying any specific references to things that are ongoing, as well as anything that might be a part of my own personal efforts. So I'm going to try to keep this in a general context in order to keep authentic with that praxis that I have been engaged thus far. The first consideration has to do with the discussion regarding certificates and the use of these accountants' certificates as an aid in selling. I believe the certifications, as well as the licensing, concerning all of those in an intermediary position or an intermediate position, are actually very significant and important. I believe it is possible for these to actually be used as a form of security in assuring that transactions that may be going to or through the individual banker or institutions with whom the banker is affiliated can be tracked and verified in order to maintain the integrity of the original intent for the onset of the investment, as well as to prevent against any sort of illicit activities that might otherwise undermine the quality of what's being offered, especially if we're considering public securities and or the intersection of public securities in some investment paradigm that might be shared with a corporate security, then the capacity to have the authentication of the certificates involved in all of those in the various stages, as well as to be able to cross-reference them with any licensing, is very important. This is not a unique conceptualization when it comes to banking. Indeed, there are other systems, including ones that have more recently attempted to engage their other operations into the system of financialization, that have already established such precedents. And the adherence to those kinds of precedents and policies provide for safety, including public safety, as well as assuring that private individuals participating in intersecting through those systems have the capacity to maintain their privacy. It's important that there be a distinction and yet an understanding regarding the role of protecting privacy of the individual, even while maintaining the integrity of a public system, including a public finance system. Secondly, there's something very compelling about this statement here, wherein he discusses I'm going to quote this specifically. Such need of large sums does not arise except from time to time where maturing loans are to be met or when some existing public utility plant is to be taken over from private owners. Now, it's worth acknowledging this book was written more than 100 years ago. But in the consideration specifically of this part here discussing maturing loans are to be met, and there's another part on the next page that discusses the meeting of those maturing loans, especially when it comes to public obligations connected to public securities like municipals, are to be met with tax revenue. Well, this brings up the original concern that was brought up on the first day concerning appropriate taxation. Who pays the taxes? And what about the concept of the quality and the, shall we say, discretion involved with the system of taxation? An official explication of the role of taxation is not just about something to avoid. There's actually a duty and a responsibility that comes with taxation, but the possibility of the benefits, including the benefits that prevent against exploitation, including financial exploitation, are of significant concern, especially when one discusses a possibility or a process of a long-term arrangement based on a budgeting for accomplishments that are supposed to materialize later down the way in the course of engaging and committing to an obligation. And concepts of all of the different capacities in which the obligations are met at the time so that they can be evaluated in the context of things that are already ongoing needs to be considered also, in addition to the concept of something necessarily coming to maturation and being able to rightfully expect that it will be able to transition by being able to mature and then from that maturation be able to be invested in other matters or to not even be invested, including if the intent was to allow for circulation or to allow for use in an investment paradigm with an understanding that once the maturity came, then it would be able to withdraw itself from that particular systematology of financing or that specific location or concept or engagement with that particular kind of financing. This is part of one of the situations we're dealing with now with this concept of catastrophe and not appropriately budgeting for the necessary maintenance costs that are associated, especially with public facilities and or public assets that include fixed assets that necessarily need maintenance to be provided as not only a manner in which to prevent against artificial depreciation, but also to allow for a maintenance and perhaps even an accrual of value, as in value added during the lifetime of the original obligation incurred in connection with that asset so that it can then be made available for public good and public use. This then goes into the second point, discussing existing public utility plant is to be taken over from private owners. Well, as I said, this was written over 100 years ago. So then there is the possibility of consideration of the inverse. We're in a situation where so-called public utilities are being determined to not be viable as a public finance regime. And so then comes questions or concerns about processes whereby reconsideration of what it takes to, as they say, stabilize that specific utility come into effect. And then who is positioned or allowed to be acknowledged as creditable in order to participate in whatever the necessary remedy is. Now we're in a situation where in a larger context we have had several decades of imposed privatization of what were previously considered to be national assets. And now, for instance, the United States is again in a situation where it is understood that there is a crisis of some sort that is necessitating a change to the financial system. And so considerations of collectivization of assets as well as a modification of the pre-existing financial regime are ongoing. These are crucial matters, and I do hope that we are not returning to a situation wherein the accrual of intentional mischaracterizations of events as they are occurring allow for a perpetuation of a trajectory that turns out to be long-term unsustainable, only to find out years down the road that it was demonstrated that on the onset, it was intentionally mischaracterized at the onset in order specifically to accrue that instability at a later point. In order to do what? The balance between the private sector and public financing is very important. It reminds me of something that was said in the original publication of information concerning one of the people that's identified as providing the impetus for the founding of the Federal Reserve banking system in the United States. And this discussion of the concept of what happens when things are allowed to be done in the public that go badly and who ends up taking responsibility. The role of the private financier in terms of maintaining public goods or a public, including a public from whence consumers are created and markets are created and sustained, who ultimately bears the price for intentional indiscretion that is not honestly and appropriately addressed at the time. This is a very significant consideration, and I look forward to discussing it more moving on.